And then if the grass growth rate drops below that, as a manager, you can go, okay, I gotta do something different. Probably the hardest piece of information to get when you're trying to calculate carrying capacity is the production potential part of the land. We're pretty comfortable with what's an average animal weight, and OMAFRA's got resources if you need them for like, how do you figure out how much dry matter that class and size of animal is going to be eating per day, and then it's easy math to get to how much your herd or flock is eating. The harder bit is how much of this can we produce in a year? Running out of grass is a grazing manager's biggest fear. And some of you may have seen a graph like this before. So quick show of hands, who's seen something similar to this? Few of you, okay. I'm gonna go over it just to make sure everybody understands what we're looking at here. So we've got months of the year across the bottom, and this blue line here is representing how quickly our cool season perennial grasses and legumes are growing. So it's probably not a surprise to any of us that grasses tend to grow very quickly in the spring. Then we get into those hot, dry conditions in July and August, and grass growth rates drop quite dramatically. Sometimes they even stop, depending on the year. And then we often see growth rates pick up again in the fall, okay? So we get what's colloquially known as spring flush, summer slump, bit of fall regrowth, okay? So this is the classic representation of how our common pasture species grow. There's something that has always bothered me. There's no y-axis. How fast is fast? How slow is slow? I have no idea. And while this sounds like it might be kind of a weird thing to get a little bit worked up about, when we're grazing, when we're managing a pasture, we are trying to make sure that our livestock don't run out of grass, like Brent said, and we are trying to balance that quality piece. So if we don't know how fast grass is growing, it makes it a little harder, sometimes a lot harder, to match supply and demand well and balance that quantity and quality equation. So if we know how fast grass is growing, and we know how much our livestock need to eat, we can actually do some math and work out what's the minimum rate of grass growth I need to know that it's gonna be regrown again by the time I get back around my rotation, okay? And then if the grass growth rate drops below that, as a manager, you can go, okay, I gotta do something different. Whether it's adding more acres to that rotation, supplementing some stored forage, early weaning, early culling, those kinds of things are all management decisions you can make, and you can be a bit more proactive about them if you can see not enough grass coming before all of a sudden your herd or your flock is at the gate bawling at you because they are hungry. It's not a good day. So how do we figure out how fast grass is growing? How do we figure out how much grass we're producing in a year to do Birgit's carrying capacity calculation? There are lots of different tools and options and ways that people might measure pasture. We'll start with this one. What's this?
Meter stick.
Meter stick, it's a ruler, right? Every one of you has seen a ruler. Advantages of a ruler, you probably already have one. If you don't, they're very inexpensive at the hardware store, so readily available, which is great. Disadvantages of a ruler. Can anyone tell me?
Doesn't count the density.
Exactly. It doesn't account for how thick your pasture is. So everybody take a look down at your boots. When I'm talking about pasture thickness, I'm talking about, can you see any bare soil? If so, how much, right? That's the kind of thing we're talking about with pasture thickness. If you were working in grain crops, we'd be talking about plant population per acre or per hectare. But just the nature of pastures and how these plants tiller, we don't think of it so much as plants per acre, but we do think about how thick that stand is. So this is a lovely thick pasture, or hayfield, or both. And so right now, you know, I can stick my ruler in and we can say, okay, this is upside down. This is you know, maybe 14, 15 inches, some of this taller stuff here. Do I have the same amount of forage if we could see some bare soil in there and it was the same height? No, right? A thin stand is going to have less forage at the same height than a thick stand. So a ruler is a good start, but the drawback is it doesn't account for that stand thickness. So if you have different pastures on your farm that some are thin and some are thick, it's gonna be very difficult to compare those pastures on height basis alone. All right, these three are all the same type of thing. Does anyone know what these are? Grazing sticks, yeah. Sometimes they're called pasture sticks, sometimes they're called sward sticks, sometimes they're pasture rulers. But basically, these are an attempt to overcome the shortfall of the ruler, which is that rulers don't do density. So all of these have some sort of ruler on one side, but then they also have a way to account for that stand thickness. Each of them do it in different ways. So my collection here, this one has you estimate the percent of ground cover when you look at your boots. So I'm looking at this and I'm going, that would be greater than 90% ground cover for this particular one. Okay, so that's how this one has you do it. This one oversimplified life, and they have low, average, or high, and then they give you a management practice that so this is my least favorite stick. This one overshot the mark in trying to make this simple. But so they're saying low density would be hayfield aftermath growth, continuously grazed pasture. Average density is a well-managed rotationally grazed pasture, or high density is ultra dense rotationally grazed pasture. I don't know how you would choose between average and high, and I've seen some hayfields that have tillered quite a bit. So I don't love how they did this, but again, you gotta pick, is this low, average, or high in terms of thickness, and then that changes what you do with your ruler height stuff. This one might actually be my favorite in terms of how it has you figure out stand thickness. So with this one, it's got a little grid on the side with some dots in it. You take the stick, you slide it along the ground, which if I hadn't stepped on this would be easier. And then you look straight down and count how many dots you can see. The fewer dots, I can't see any dots right now, but the fewer dots you can see, the thicker the stand is. So that helps figure out which calibration to use on the stick. So the idea is you figure out your stand thickness, you measure your height, and those two numbers combined, there's a chart on the side of each of these, and you work out how many pounds per acre per inch of dry matter you would have. I work for the government. I'm not allowed to promote one company over the other. So one of these is from a company that sells infrastructure equipment internationally. Anita. The second one is from a grazing conference in West Virginia. This is the one where they tried to make it really simple, and I think they overshot. Because like if you look at their calibrations, they give one number instead of a range. The other two sticks give a range. This one has no wiggle room. It's far too confident. No one in West Virginia knows what Birgit's pasture looks like. Sorry. This third one is from the Great Lakes Grazing Network. So they were active in like the early 2000s. So this is the one that does the cool dot thing. Maybe late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere in that range. When they're on trend, when they're fashionable, you can pick them up as ag swag at a farm show or a grazing conference or those kinds of events. When they're not having a moment in the spotlight, good luck. So about a month ago, I went online to see if you could just buy one. Couldn't find any. Depending on where a grazing stick is calibrated, it may or may not apply directly to your farm. So that was my knock against West Virginia, is West Virginia is a long way from Manitoulin Island, right? This one from the fencing company, I mean, they've got pretty wide range on it. They've also split out different warm season grasses and cool season grasses. So this one was developed for the North American market. And with over time using it, you could probably work out for yourself, is my pasture in the high end of the range? Is it in the low end of the range? So overall, not a bad stick, but a little tricky to know where in North America it was calibrated. This one also has a bunch of species. Yeah. So this is the Great Lakes Grazing Network one. It has a tighter range than the other stick. And because we're in the Great Lakes Basin, heck, we're in the middle of a Great Lake right now, this one's probably the most applicable to us. So just, if you do get your hands on a grazing stick, these are things to keep in the back of your mind. They're a great tool, I'm not knocking them, but every tool has limitations. Those are the limitations on the sticks. Better than just a ruler on its own, but thinking about that calibration and watching your livestock to understand, okay, am I on the high end of a range, am I on the low end of a range? I brought 2 other tools. Like I said, there's options when it comes to ways you could measure pasture to help with that inventory management. So I'm gonna need my old friend, the ruler. I'm also gonna need this. This is called a falling plate meter. Okay, there are 2 types of plate meters. I'm gonna show you the other one in a second. But this is a falling plate meter. And as you can see, this is potentially a DIY project. I didn't make this specific one, but I have made some of these before. Basically how it works is you take your ruler and you make sure that the 0 side is against the ground. I struggle with that part. And so you get your ruler, you put it through the hole in the middle and you gently lower the plate. That's why it's a falling plate meter. You gently lower the plate until your pasture holds it up, okay? So this is giving us what's called a compressed height or compressed sward height. Sward being a grasslandy word for stand. It's more like British English, but it's sward. So compressed sward height, and basically we're gonna see what our measurement is on the top of the plate. So 4 inches, about 10 centimeters. And the idea with this is that compressed sward height is combining ruler height and stand thickness into one number. Okay, so it's accounting for both of those things at the same time, which is handy. Plate meters really work well on grasses, clovers, trefoil, and the vegetative stage. As soon as those things start to head out, not very good. Alfalfa can be a bit of a challenge because it naturally is a bit more stemmy, and any of our very stemmy woody weeds, but those tend to be less palatable anyway. So hopefully your pasture is more stuff you want than stuff you don't want. We don't have a calibration on those yet, Brent, because I'm still in the process of double checking our calibration for this to make sure it's gonna be worth your while so that you guys don't have to slog through the calibrating like you would with the falling plates. I do have a product on the go. We have 16 farms involved with that are testing this and are going to provide some feedback on where it's useful, where it's not useful, right? Every tool has its limitations. Any one of these might be the right tool for you, okay? So they're helping get some feedback on what situations is this the right tool in Ontario, and just letting us make sure that the calibration work that a grad student did for the last 2 years is solid. So we're doing some of those tests, so there will be a calibration for one of these out soon. Probably someday. Right now, there's a lot of overpromise and underdeliver when it comes to some of the remote sensing technology in agriculture, right? So everybody's still figuring out how that works. Satellite imagery works far better on a single species crop, right? Because it's supposed to be one shade of green. And if you have part of the field or the whole field that's the wrong shade of green for that time of year, send in the scout to figure out what's going on. Is there an insect problem? Is there a disease problem? A friend of mine on a dairy farm has some sort of remote sensing thing going on, and she got an alert one day and looked at the photo and then realized that the reason it's alerting that the color green changed was because her mom was baling hay. So the hay field was changing color quickly, and the satellite went, that's weird, and triggered the thing. So, but it's straight alfalfa, they're a dairy farm. So this is the problem we have with pastures, is that our pastures tend to be mixed species stands. That's fantastic for biodiversity. That's fantastic for soil health. That's fantastic for maybe getting a more diverse mineral profile into our livestock diets. That makes it really hard for a satellite and a computer to understand what's happening in that field and whether we're getting the right biomass. So I do think potentially in the future, yeah, that could work. but we're not there yet. And countries that are using satellite imagery for their crop insurance programs, for those kinds of predictive things, tend to rely on straight ryegrass or ryegrass clover mixtures, and they have 40 plus years of rising plate meter data. So they can ground truth that very quickly, right? They can, in a 2-year project, they can go back in the archives, pull up all the satellite imagery photos, match it to their plate meter data, create a calibration curve, and they're off to the races. We're working with mixed species pastures and we don't have the historic measurements. So trying to do that in a 3-year project or even a 5-year project, we don't quite have the groundwork done yet. So I think in the future, yes, I think in the future satellites probably could help us figure out how fast pasture's growing. Will you be able to get that data real time to help you with your inventory decisions? I don't know. My original question of how fast is fast, how slow is slow. So yes, I'm literally watching grass grow in my job. Some of the raw data looks like this. So this one on top, this blue line, is 8 site years averaged together plus part of the early part of this year. So this is 4 sites in 2020, or in 2021, 4 sites in 2022, and part of 1 site in 23. And as you can see, that's not the same shape as what I showed you on the other page, right? And even when we break it down, so 2021 is the dark blue through here, 2022 is the orange, and then we have gray to about here in like late May, because I haven't had a chance to update this graph for you, sorry, is the gray is 23. So you can tell that it's not making quite that same shape. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that this is only a couple of years of data. Over time, as we get more growing seasons in a data set, I would expect to see a bit more of a difference between spring and summer. Second thing that is affecting what these graphs look like is that weather and management play a role in those growth rates. Okay, so everyone goes, oh, well, it didn't rain and so my grass is growing slowly. And yes, that's part of it. Our cool season perennial plants love temperatures between 15 and 25 degrees. They will grow outside that temperature range, but that's the sweet spot. They also really love it when it rains like every 3 days and drains away. Most of them don't love to stand in wet soil and have like saturated soils, but every 3 days rain, they love that. So if we're outside those parameters, which typically summer in Ontario tends to be hotter than 25, and we get a thunderstorm every 2 weeks, although this summer, it's every 2 days. This summer is maybe not as good of an example of that. Yeah, so there's a few things going on, but the other piece here is looking at the data coming from some of these individual farms that are feeding into this, the management does play a role. So having that rotational grazing system, farms that are having a bit more success keeping the grass in that vegetative growth state tend to have faster regrowth. And one thing we did see, I know some of you are aware, there was a bad drought in northwestern Ontario in 2021. One of the things that came out of that drought is pastures that were rotationally managed tended to have between a month and 6 weeks more forage than pastures that were continuously grazed. So that wasn't always enough to get them through the season. That drought was very severe, but we did see, because those pastures went into that bad weather in better condition, because those plants were healthy, because they'd had that opportunity to rest, they were more productive longer, despite the fact that the weather was not conducive to growth at all. All right, last thing I want to share with you is the whole point of understanding, how fast is the grass growing and why would we measure it, is that inventory challenge, right? We don't want to run out of pasture for our livestock. And I mentioned that if you know how fast your grass is growing, you can work out if it's growing fast enough to keep up with livestock demand. So this is the formula for doing that. Animal demand is something Birgit already talked about in her carrying capacity bit when we were standing in the driveway. So as a refresher, you need to know the average body weight on your animals. You need to know the typical percent of their body weight they consume per day. That changes with your class of livestock. So, with those cow-calf pairs, 2.6% is an average for over the whole year. Our sheep producers, you're looking more at like 3%. Anyone grazing dairy animals, cows or otherwise? Nobody? I'm gonna tell you anyway, you probably need to budget like 4%, 4 to 4.5, okay? So yeah, body weight, percent of body weight they eat, and number of head in the group will give you your animal demand per day. And then your stocking rate, so that's how many animals per acre, but we're thinking about the entire pasture platform itself, okay? So stocking rate is over your grazing season. How many acres have they got? Stocking density is how many acres do they have access to at a point in time, okay? So rate, we're looking at the whole season. If you multiply demand by your rate, that will give you a number. That's your minimum grass growth rate to keep up with animal demand. So if you're going around in a rotation and your grass growth rate is higher than this answer, it should be keeping up, okay? How do you figure out the grass growth rate? You take your measuring tool, measure throughout the season. So perfect world, I'd say once a week, once every 2 weeks works as well. It's just like calculating average daily gains on young stock. So you have a starting measurement, you have a later measurement, you find the difference, you divide by the number of days between measurements, you get, in this case, a grass growth rate per day, an average grass growth rate per day. So it's the same math as an average daily gain, but instead of being in pounds per head for your stockers or grams per head for your lambs, we're talking kilograms of dry matter per hectare or pounds of dry matter per acre per day.